There is a version of autism that nobody sees, not because it is hidden on purpose, although it often is, but because the entire framework most people use to understand autism was not built to see it. When most people hear the word autism, they picture something specific. They picture a child, usually a boy, who does not make eye contact, who does not speak, who lines up toys in rows, who has obvious and visible differences that are apparent within minutes of meeting them. And for decades, that was autism. That was the image. That was the diagnostic template. That was the only version that got recognized, studied, and supported. But there is another version, a version where the person speaks fluently, where they hold jobs, where they have relationships, where they navigate social situations well enough that nobody around them suspects anything, where the challenges are real and significant and constant but are happening entirely beneath the surface, invisible to everyone except the person living inside them. This version is called Level 1 autism, and it is the most underdiagnosed, most misunderstood, and most psychologically costly presentation on the entire spectrum. If you are watching this video, there is a reasonable chance you are either Level 1 autistic and do not know it, or you know someone who is and neither of you has the framework to understand what is actually happening. By the end of this video, you will have that framework. I am going to cover everything: what Level 1 autism actually is, how it differs from what you think autism looks like, the invisible signs that clinicians miss, the myths that prevent diagnosis, the real daily experience of living with it, how to recognize it in yourself or someone you care about, what to do if you recognize it, and what the research actually says about outcomes, support, and the cost of not knowing. This is the definitive guide. If you watch this video to the end, you will understand Level 1 autism better than most professionals. And I do not say that lightly. If this is the kind of deep, thorough content that changes how you see the world, this channel is where it lives. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next, and hit the like button because it pushes this to the people who are desperately searching for exactly this information right now. Let me start with what Level 1 autism actually is, because even the terminology is confusing and most people get it wrong. Level 1. Autism is a designation from the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, used by clinicians worldwide to diagnose psychological and developmental conditions. When the DSM-5 was published, it collapsed several previous diagnoses, including what was previously called Asperger's syndrome, into a single diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder. And it introduced 3 levels of severity based on support needs. Level 3 means requiring very substantial support. Level 2 means requiring substantial support. And Level 1 means requiring support, not no support. Not a little support. Support. The word is in the clinical definition, and it matters because it directly contradicts the most common misconception about Level 1 autism, which is that it is the mild version, the easy version, the version that does not really count. Level 1 autism is not mild autism. It is autism with a less visible presentation, and those are two very different things. A person with Level 1 autism may have an above-average IQ. They may have strong verbal skills. They may hold a degree, a career, a family, but they may also struggle profoundly with executive functioning, sensory overload, emotional regulation, social interpretation, and the constant, exhausting effort of navigating a world that was designed for a type of brain they do not have. The struggles are real. They are just invisible. And invisible struggles are the ones that go unrecognized, unsupported, and untreated, sometimes for decades. This is the first and most important thing to understand about Level 1 autism. The level does not describe the severity of the autism. It describes the visibility of the autism. A Level 1 autistic person is not less autistic than a Level 3 autistic person. They are autistic in a way that is harder to see from the outside. And because it is harder to see, they are less likely to receive a diagnosis, less likely to receive support, less likely to receive understanding from the people in their lives, and more likely to spend years, sometimes their entire lives, believing that there is something fundamentally wrong with them that they cannot name. Now let me explain how Level 1 autism actually works in daily life, because this is where the gap between the clinical description and the lived experience becomes enormous. The DSM-5 describes Level 1 autism as having difficulty initiating social interactions and exhibiting unusual or unsuccessful responses to social advances from others, with clear evidence that the deficits cause noticeable impairment. It also describes inflexible behavior, difficulty switching between activities, and problems with organization and planning. That is the clinical language. Here is what it actually looks like. It looks like a person who can have a conversation with you that seems perfectly normal, but who is running a real-time processing system in their head that is monitoring your facial expressions, calculating the appropriate length of eye contact, selecting responses from a pre-rehearsed library of phrases, tracking the rhythm of turn-taking, suppressing their natural communication style, and managing their sensory environment simultaneously. They are doing in real time, through conscious effort, what your brain does automatically. And the effort is invisible because the output, the conversation, looks normal. But the cost is enormous. It looks like a person who gets home from work and cannot speak for 2 hours. Not because they are angry, not because they had a bad day, but because their brain has been running at maximum capacity for 8 hours and it has nothing left. They used all their processing power on the performance of normalcy, and the tank is empty. Their partner asks, "How was your day?" And they cannot answer, not because they do not want to, but because the cognitive resources required to formulate a sentence and deliver it with appropriate affect are genuinely depleted. It looks like a person who has a meltdown because the restaurant changed the menu, not because they are dramatic, not because they are spoiled, but because they had a plan. The plan included knowing what they were going to order. Knowing what they were going to order was part of the cognitive scaffolding that made the entire social experience of dining out manageable. And when the menu changed, a piece of the scaffolding collapsed, and the load it was carrying fell on them all at once. It looks like a person who cannot start a task, even though they know exactly what the task is and exactly how to do it. Not because they are lazy, not because they lack motivation, but because the executive function required to initiate a neurological process that involves the prefrontal cortex organizing and sequencing behavior is impaired. Research has shown that autistic individuals display significant executive function deficits across multiple domains, including planning, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. The task sits there. They stare at it. They know they should do it. They want to do it. And they cannot make their brain start it. This is not a character flaw. This is neurology. It looks like a person who is described by colleagues as a little intense, or a little rigid, or a little awkward, or a little difficult. Always a little. Never enough to warrant concern. Never enough to trigger a referral. Never enough to be taken seriously. Just enough to make life harder in ways that accumulate invisibly over years until the person is drowning in a sea of small difficulties that individually seem trivial and collectively are devastating. This is Level 1 autism, not mild, not easy, not the lucky version, the invisible version. And I want to add something here because I think it is critical for understanding why Level 1 autism goes undiagnosed for so long. The invisibility is not just passive, it is actively maintained. Level 1. Autistic adults are not simply failing to show symptoms, they are actively suppressing them. They are working every day to prevent their differences from being visible. And they have been doing this for so long, many since early childhood, that they do not even recognize it as effort anymore. It has become their default operating mode. The performance is so practiced that it feels like reality, and the real self, the unmasked self, has been pushed so far below the surface that even the person living it may not be able to access it on demand. This is why you cannot always trust a level 1 autistic person's self-report about their own internal experience. If you ask them, "Are you okay?" they will say yes, not because they are lying, but because the word okay has been redefined by decades of adaptation. Their version of okay includes a constant background level of sensory discomfort, social exhaustion, executive function strain, and emotional management that would be categorized as distinctly not okay by any neurotypical standard. They have never experienced the neurotypical baseline, so they have no reference point for comparison. Their normal includes a level of daily effort that would be considered extraordinary by anyone who understood what was happening beneath the surface. Now let me talk about the types of invisible signs because this is where most guides and most clinicians fail. They describe the signs that are visible. I am going to describe the signs that are not. The first category of invisible signs is social processing delay. Most people think that autistic people do not understand social cues. At level 1, the truth is different. Level 1 autistic adults often do understand social cues. They just process them on a different timeline. The neurotypical brain processes facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language automatically and instantly through a network of brain regions that handle social cognition without conscious effort. The level 1 autistic brain often processes the same information analytically through the prefrontal cortex, which means it requires conscious attention and takes more time. Research has found that many high-masking autistic people analytically decode facial expressions and body signals by recruiting the prefrontal cortex rather than the social brain network that handles this processing automatically in neurotypical individuals. The result is not misunderstanding, it is delay. The autistic person gets the right answer, but they get it 2 seconds late. And in social interaction, 2 seconds is a lifetime. The joke lands, they laugh, but the laugh is slightly delayed and slightly performed. The sarcasm registers, but only after a beat of confusion that they learn to hide. The emotional tone of a conversation shifts. They detect the shift, but by the time they have adjusted their response, the moment has passed and they are slightly out of sync with the flow of the exchange. This delay is invisible to casual observers. It only becomes apparent over extended interaction, and even then, it is usually described in vague terms. Something feels off about them, but I cannot put my finger on it. They seem a little robotic sometimes. They are smart, but socially weird. These descriptions are not insults. They are neurotypical people detecting, at a subconscious level, the slight asynchrony that social processing delay creates. They feel it, but they cannot name it, and the autistic person feels it too. They know something is not quite landing. They know the timing is slightly wrong, and they compensate by working harder, processing faster, masking more intensely, which increases the cognitive load, which accelerates the exhaustion, which eventually leads to burnout. The second category of invisible signs is sensory gating failure. Most people know that autistic people can have sensory sensitivities. But at level 1, the sensory experience is often invisible because the person has learned to suppress their reactions. They do not cover their ears in a loud restaurant. They do not leave the room when the lights are too bright. They sit there. They endure it. They perform normalcy while their nervous system is screaming. The technical term for what is happening is sensory gating failure. In a neurotypical brain, the thalamus acts as a filter, deciding which sensory information to send to conscious awareness and which to suppress. The hum of the air conditioning, the flicker of fluorescent lights, the texture of clothing against skin. The neurotypical brain filters most of this out automatically. The autistic brain often does not. The filter is thinner, more information gets through, and the result is a constant, low-grade overwhelm that the person has learned to tolerate, but that costs energy, attention, and emotional bandwidth throughout the entire day. I want you to understand what this actually feels like, because most descriptions of sensory sensitivity are too abstract. Imagine you are trying to have a conversation with someone in a room where a fire alarm is going off at low volume, not loud enough to be an emergency, just loud enough to require constant effort to ignore. You can still have the conversation, you can still understand the words, but part of your brain is always dedicated to filtering that alarm, and that part is not available for anything else. Now imagine the alarm never stops. Not for the entire conversation, not for the entire meal, not for the entire workday, not for the entire evening at home where the refrigerator hums and the clock ticks and the light fixture buzzes and your clothing has a seam that presses against your skin in exactly the wrong way. The alarm is always there, and the effort of ignoring it is always happening, and nobody else in the room can hear it. That is level 1 sensory experience. Not dramatic, not obvious, not the kind of thing that makes you cover your ears or leave the room. Just a relentless, invisible drain on cognitive resources that leaves you with less capacity for everything else. This is why level 1 autistic adults are often described as having anxiety for no reason. The reason is sensory. They are anxious because their nervous system is being bombarded with stimuli that their brain cannot filter out, and the effort of appearing unaffected by the bombardment is exhausting. They go to the doctor. They get an anxiety diagnosis. They get medication for anxiety. And the medication may help with the secondary anxiety, but it does nothing about the primary cause, which is that their sensory processing system is working overtime every day in environments that were designed for brains with better filters. There is another category of invisible signs that rarely gets discussed, and it is emotional regulation differences. Level 1 autistic adults often experience emotions at a different intensity and on a different timeline than neurotypical people. This does not mean they feel less. Many feel more. The emotional experience can be overwhelming in its intensity, but the expression of that emotion may be delayed, muted, or mismatched with the situation. You receive devastating news and feel nothing for 3 days, then suddenly break down in the shower on a random Tuesday. You experience joy so intensely that it physically hurts, but your face shows only a slight smile because your emotional expression system and your emotional experience system are not synchronized. You feel a surge of anger that has no obvious trigger and cannot understand where it came from, only to realize hours later that something that happened at lunch was bothering you and your emotional processing system needed that long to decode the signal. Research on emotion regulation in autism has established that autistic individuals commonly present with emotion regulation impairment alongside executive dysfunction. These are not separate problems. They interact. When executive function is strained, emotional regulation becomes harder. When emotional regulation is compromised, executive function suffers. And at level 1, both of these systems are under constant strain from masking, sensory processing, and social performance, creating a cascading effect where each difficulty amplifies the others. The result is a person who seems fine on the outside and is barely holding together on the inside. And when the holding finally fails, when the meltdown or shutdown arrives, the people around them are shocked because they had no idea anything was wrong. How could they? The entire system was designed to make sure they had no idea. The third category of invisible signs is the masking cost cycle, and this is the one that has the most devastating long-term consequences. Masking is the term for the process by which autistic people suppress their natural behaviors and communication style and perform neurotypical behaviors instead. It includes scripting conversations, forcing eye contact, suppressing stims, mirroring other people's body language, and managing facial expressions to match social expectations. Research on camouflaging in autism has established that masking involves enormous cognitive effort and is associated with increased rates of depression, anxiety, identity confusion, and suicidal ideation. But what makes masking particularly destructive at level 1 is the feedback loop it creates. The more successfully you mask, the more normal you appear. The more normal you appear, the less support you receive. The less support you receive, the more you need to mask. The more you need to mask, the more energy it costs. The more energy it costs, the less you have available for actually living your life. And eventually, the system collapses. This collapse is called autistic burnout, and it is one of the most significant and least recognized clinical events in adult autism. Autistic burnout is not regular burnout. Regular burnout is caused by too much work and too little rest. Autistic burnout is caused by too much masking and too little accommodation. The symptoms include profound exhaustion that does not improve with rest, decreased ability to function in areas where the person was previously competent, increased sensory sensitivity, loss of executive function, regression of skills, and a collapse of the masking capacity itself. People in autistic burnout describe losing the ability to do things they could do before. Cooking, driving, managing finances, maintaining conversations. Tasks that were difficult but manageable suddenly become impossible. And because they were never diagnosed, because their autism was invisible, they do not understand what is happening. They think they are having a mental breakdown. They think they are developing a new psychiatric condition. They go to therapists who do not screen for autism and who diagnose them with depression or anxiety or personality disorders, and the real cause remains invisible. I have seen this pattern so many times that I can describe the trajectory almost to the letter. The person functions well through their 20s, maybe even thriving in a structured environment like university where the social demands are predictable and the routines are built into the system. Then they enter the unstructured world of adult life, careers, relationships, independent living, parenting, and the demand on their mogging and executive function increases exponentially. They manage for a while, sometimes years, by working harder, masking more intensely, sleeping less, and ignoring every signal their body sends them that something is unsustainable. And then, usually triggered by an increase in life complexity, a new job, a move, a breakup, a pandemic, the system crashes. Not gradually, catastrophically. The burnout phase can last months or years. Skills that were already hard become impossible. Social interaction becomes unbearable. Sensory sensitivity skyrockets. Executive function collapses to the point where making a meal or answering an email feels like climbing a mountain. And the person who has spent their entire life performing normalcy suddenly cannot perform anymore. The mask is gone. Not voluntarily removed, but involuntarily destroyed by exhaustion. This is often the moment of diagnosis. The person ends up in a clinician's office, presenting with what looks like severe depression, and a skilled clinician notices the pattern. The lifelong social difficulty, the sensory history, the rigid routines, the special interests, the exhaustion that does not respond to antidepressants, and the diagnosis comes. Not as a surprise in retrospect, but as a revelation. Oh, that is what this has been, the whole time. Now I want to talk about the myths that keep level 1 autism invisible, because these myths are not just wrong. They are actively harmful. They are the barriers between autistic adults and the understanding they need. The first and most damaging myth is that if you were not diagnosed as a child, you are not autistic. This is false. The DSM-5 explicitly states that autism symptoms may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. This language was specifically included to account for exactly the situation we are discussing. Adults who were autistic all along but whose masking and compensatory strategies prevented diagnosis. Being undiagnosed in childhood does not mean you were not autistic. It means the diagnostic system failed to detect you. The second myth is that autistic people cannot have successful relationships, careers, or social lives. At level 1, many autistic adults have all of these things. They have them at a cost that nobody sees, but they have them. The presence of external success does not rule out autism. It rules out the most visible presentations of autism. The internal experience may still include constant social processing effort, sensory overwhelm, executive function difficulties, and chronic masking fatigue. A person can be autistic and successful. They can also be autistic and exhausted by the effort that success requires. The third myth is that autism is something you can see. At level 1, often you cannot. The entire point of the level 1 designation is that the differences are not immediately apparent. They are there. They are real. They are measurable. But they are expressed internally rather than externally. A clinician who expects autism to be visible will miss level 1 autism every single time. And this is not a hypothetical concern. Research has found that level 1 autism is frequently misdiagnosed as anxiety, depression, OCD, borderline personality disorder, or attention deficit disorder. The updated DSM-5 mandates that clinicians look beneath the mask, but many clinicians have not been trained to do this. The fourth myth is that autism is a male condition. The 4-to-1 male-to-female diagnosis ratio does not reflect the actual prevalence of autism in women. It reflects the diagnostic bias. Research has consistently shown that women and girls are diagnosed later, less frequently, and less accurately than men and boys, primarily because the diagnostic criteria were developed based on male presentations. Women are more likely to mask, more likely to develop socially acceptable special interests, more likely to internalize their difficulties rather than externalize them, and more likely to be given an alternative psychiatric diagnosis before autism is ever considered. The number of women diagnosed with level 1 autism in adulthood is growing rapidly, not because autism in women is new, but because the recognition of it is new. There is a fifth myth that I think is particularly damaging in the context of level 1 autism, and it is the myth that autistic people lack empathy. This is not just wrong, it is the opposite of the truth for many level 1 autistic adults. Many experience what researchers describe as hyperempathy, an emotional empathy that is so intense it is overwhelming. They do not lack the ability to feel what others feel. They lack the ability to regulate the intensity of what they feel when exposed to other people's emotions. They absorb the emotional atmosphere of a room, the way their sensory system absorbs sounds and lights, without an adequate filter. The problem is not that they do not care. The problem is that they care so much that it is physiologically overwhelming, and the coping strategy they develop, emotional withdrawal or apparent flatness, gets misinterpreted as the absence of empathy when it is actually the defense against an excess of it. This misunderstanding alone has probably destroyed more relationships involving level 1 autistic adults than any other single factor. Their partner experiences them as cold, distant, or uncaring. The autistic person experiences themselves as overwhelmed, flooded, and desperately trying to manage an emotional intensity that they cannot modulate. Both experiences are real. Both people are suffering. And the gap between them is the gap of misunderstanding that a diagnosis can close. Now let me talk about how level 1 autism specifically affects work environments, because this is where many adults first begin to suspect that something is different about them. The modern workplace is designed for neurotypical brains. Open-plan offices provide constant sensory bombardment. Meetings require real-time social processing with multiple people simultaneously. Performance reviews demand the ability to read implicit expectations that were never stated explicitly. Career advancement often depends more on social navigation than on competence. And the unwritten rules of workplace culture, when to speak, when to stay quiet, how to disagree without offending, how to advocate for yourself without seeming pushy, are precisely the kind of rules that Level 1 autistic adults struggle with because they have to decode consciously what their neurotypical colleagues process intuitively. Many Level 1 autistic adults are exceptionally good at their actual jobs. They are often the most technically competent person in the room. Their attention to detail is extraordinary. Their ability to focus deeply on a single task for extended periods is a genuine cognitive advantage. Their systematic thinking produces work that is thorough and precise, but they get passed over for promotions because they are perceived as lacking soft skills. They get negative feedback about communication style. They struggle with the transition between tasks that meetings constantly demand. They find small talk exhausting and avoid the informal social interactions that build workplace relationships. And they are often the first to burn out because the cognitive cost of navigating the social environment of the office is added on top of the cognitive cost of the work itself. This is why so many Level 1 autistic adults cycle through jobs, not because they cannot do the work, because the work environment costs more than the work itself. They leave not because they failed at their job, but because they succeeded at their job while simultaneously failing to survive the environment in which the job existed. Now I want to describe what the best approach looks like for someone who suspects they may be Level 1 autistic, because this is where the information needs to become actionable. If you are watching this video and recognizing yourself in the descriptions, the first step is not to diagnose yourself. The first step is to gather information. Learn what Level 1 autism actually looks like in adults. Read accounts from diagnosed adults. Take validated screening tools like the RADS-R or the CAT-Q, which specifically measures camouflaging behaviors. These tools are not diagnostic. They are directional. They tell you whether further evaluation is warranted, and for many adults, they are the first time anyone or anything has validated what they have been experiencing their entire lives. The second step, if the screening tools suggest it is warranted, is to seek a formal evaluation from a clinician who specializes in adult autism, particularly Level 1 and high-masking presentations. This is not the same as going to a general psychologist or psychiatrist. Most general mental health professionals have not been trained to identify Level 1 autism in adults. They will see the anxiety. They will see the depression. They will see the executive function difficulties. And they will treat those as primary conditions rather than recognizing them as the secondary consequences of undiagnosed autism. And this connects directly to something I want to mention. If you have been watching this and realizing that your brain works differently than the framework you have been given, if you are starting to see that the way you process information, make decisions, and navigate the world has always felt harder than it should, the Sharp Mind Blueprint was built for exactly that realization. It is 7 evidence-based systems for thinking clearer, faster, and sharper, designed to work with the way your brain actually operates rather than the way the world tells you it should. The QR code is on your screen right now, and the link is in the description, but stay with me because we still have ground to cover. The third step, whether or not you pursue formal diagnosis, is to begin reducing the masking load. This does not mean announcing your autism to everyone you know. It means making small, strategic changes to your environment that reduce the amount of energy you spend performing normalcy. It means identifying which sensory inputs drain you the most and finding ways to mitigate them. Noise-canceling headphones, sunglasses, choosing seats in restaurants that are away from the kitchen, requesting meetings by video instead of in person when possible. It means identifying which social obligations are genuine and which are performative, and giving yourself permission to decline the performative ones without guilt. It means building recovery time into your schedule as deliberately and non-negotiably as you build work time. These are not accommodations for a disability. These are optimizations for a brain that processes information differently. There is nothing wrong with needing a quieter environment to think clearly. There is nothing wrong with needing recovery time after social interaction. There is nothing wrong with preferring text communication over phone calls, or needing more time to process unexpected changes, or having strong preferences about food textures, or finding comfort in routines. These are features of your neurological architecture, not flaws in your character. And treating them as such, treating them as needs to be met rather than weaknesses to be overcome, is the difference between a life spent in chronic deficit and a life spent in sustainable function. I want to talk about what happens after diagnosis, or after self-recognition, because this is the part that most guides leave out. The first thing that happens is grief. And the grief is not about being autistic. It is about all the years you were autistic without knowing it. All the years you thought there was something wrong with you. All the relationships that failed because neither you nor the other person understood what was actually happening. All the jobs you lost or quit because the environment was sensorially unbearable and you did not have the language to explain it. All the energy you spent masking, performing, pretending, surviving, that could have been spent on actually living if someone had told you earlier what you were dealing with. This grief is real and it is important and it takes time. It is not self-pity. It is the appropriate emotional response to discovering that a significant amount of your suffering was caused not by your autism, but by the absence of understanding about your autism. The autism itself is not the problem. The problem is the gap between what your brain needs and what the world provides. And the grief is about all the years that gap went unrecognized. The second thing that happens is reinterpretation. You begin to reread your entire life history through a new lens. The friendships that never quite worked, the sensory experiences you could never explain, the exhaustion that doctors could not account for, the social confusion that therapy could not resolve, the interests that were too intense, the routines that were too rigid, the emotions that were too big or too delayed or too confusing. All of it, every piece, rearranges itself into a pattern that finally makes sense. Not because you have changed, because you have context. And I want to be specific about what this reinterpretation looks like because it is one of the most profound cognitive experiences a person can have. You remember being 7 years old and crying because your socks had a seam in them and your mother told you to stop being dramatic. That was not drama. That was sensory processing. You remember being 14 and eating lunch alone in the library every day? Not because you did not want friends, but because the cafeteria was so sensorially overwhelming that you could not eat and process the noise at the same time. That was not antisocial behavior. That was self-regulation. You remember being 22 and losing a job because you told your boss that his strategy had a logical flaw and you did not understand why he was angry. That was not rudeness. That was literal communication. You remember being 30 and lying on the bathroom floor after a party, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling like your body had been unplugged from a power source. That was not depression. That was autistic shutdown. Every memory gets recontextualized. Every failure gets re-explained. Every moment of shame gets transformed from evidence that you are broken into evidence that you were undiagnosed. And the relief of that transformation is matched only by the grief of how long it took to arrive. The third thing that happens, and this is the one that changes everything, is that you start to build your life around your actual brain instead of around the brain you were pretending to have. You stop forcing yourself into environments that drain you. You stop accepting social obligations that cost more than they give. You stop treating your sensory needs as weaknesses. You stop masking as a default and start choosing when and where the performance is worth the energy. And you discover, sometimes for the first time in your life, what it feels like to not be constantly exhausted by the basic act of existing in the world. This is not a small discovery. For many Level 1 autistic adults, especially those diagnosed late, this is the most significant psychological event of their entire lives. More significant than any degree, any job, any relationship milestone. The moment they understand that they are not broken, that they are different, and that the difference is nameable, knowable, and manageable, that moment divides their life into before and after. I want to give you some practical guidance for what to watch for, because many of you are watching this not for yourself, but for someone you love. If someone in your life frequently cancels plans at the last minute and you have always attributed it to flakiness or lack of interest, consider the possibility that they are managing a processing load you cannot see. If they seem fine at work but collapse at home, consider that the performance of normalcy at work is costing them everything they have, and home is where the mask falls because it has to fall somewhere. If they have strong reactions to things that seem minor to you, a change in plans, a different brand of the same product, an unexpected guest, consider that what seems minor to your brain is not minor to theirs. If they are brilliant in some areas and inexplicably incapable in others, consider that this uneven profile is a hallmark of autism, not a sign of laziness or selective effort. And if they are always tired, always anxious, always struggling in ways that do not respond to conventional treatment, consider that the conventional treatment is targeting symptoms while the cause remains invisible. Level 1 autism is not a tragedy. It is not a limitation. It is not a sentence. It is a neurological variation that, when understood and accommodated, allows people to live full, rich, meaningful lives. The tragedy is not the autism. The tragedy is the decades spent not knowing about it, the decades spent fighting your own brain instead of working with it, the decades spent in shame about differences that are not flaws, but features. And I want to close with something that I think matters deeply. If you have watched this entire video and you are sitting there with a feeling you cannot quite name, a feeling that is part recognition and part fear and part something that almost feels like relief, I want you to know that feeling is valid. You do not need a diagnosis to validate it. You do not need permission from anyone to explore it. You do not need to prove anything to anyone. The exploration itself, the willingness to ask the question, is enough for now. If you want to take the next step, if you are ready to build a framework for working with your brain instead of against it, the Sharp Mind Blueprint gives you 7 evidence-based systems for exactly that. Clearer thinking, faster processing, sharper decision-making, built for brains that work differently. The QR code is on your screen and the link is in the description. Take a look. And one more thing. If this video described your experience, or if it described someone you love, I want you to do something specific. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this video made you stop and think, "That is me." Or tell me which part made you think of someone else. I am not asking for engagement metrics. I am asking because every time someone names their experience in these comments, it validates someone else who is reading silently and wondering if they are the only one. You are not the only one. There are millions of you, and you have been invisible long enough. Share this video with someone who needs it, not with a lecture, just a link, and maybe the words, "Watch this when you have time." Sometimes that is all it takes. Subscribe if you have not already. This channel is building something that matters, a space where the invisible becomes visible, where the things nobody explains get explained, and where understanding replaces confusion. Every video is part of that project. And this one, if it reaches the right person at the right time, might be the one that changes everything. I have said this before and I will say it again. You are not broken. You are not too sensitive. You are not too intense. You are not too rigid. You are not too much. You are autistic. And autistic is not a limitation. It is an explanation for everything you have been feeling, everything you have been fighting, and everything you have been hiding. And explanations,
Explanations.
real ones, honest ones, are where freedom begins. I will see you in the next one.